Welcome to the Atma Paradigm, consciousness-based science. We're now on lecture 5 of this first part on consciousness, and today we're looking at theories and more theories, and we'll be presenting 4 physicalist approaches used to explain consciousness. So let me just recap from where we were last week. We looked at the idea that the brain somehow generates consciousness, and we analysed how that is flawed, how it doesn't explain the evidence, in fact how the neuroscience evidence really challenges that idea, and we definitely need a different picture. So it fails as neuroscience. The brain model cannot explain our experiences, it cannot explain our intuitive sense of ourselves, that we exist, that I am the subject of my experiences, and that what I experience are qualia. And what we saw is that it leads to absurd postulations of the self and reality, that either the self doesn't exist, that we experience the world on a time delay, we are not in control of anything, there is no free will, we're simply just watching on catch-up. These are ideas that actually no philosopher is satisfied with. So the brain model is failing to substantiate anything about itself. Now, I just wanted to make the point that so far in these talks, I've focused on human consciousness. And it's quite natural to raise the question, well, what about consciousness in other species? Well, the reason we've been focusing on the human consciousness is because this is the one we know directly. I have direct experience of my own consciousness, and each of you do as well, I believe. And therefore we're able to discuss what we know in terms of the human experience. And of course, it's the field that is most studied, and we are building our presentation and our thesis from that which has been studied within neuroscience and philosophy and psychology and so on. And I think there's another aspect, that by looking at human consciousness and how we experience it, we have been able to identify what is the hard problem of consciousness that needs to be dealt with. Now, once we've gone through this, and won't be too far away in the future talk, we will use these concepts and the criteria about the hard problem and what we understand about consciousness to explore the presence of consciousness in other species. And that will give us as close as we can get to an empirical analysis of consciousness in animals and consciousness even in plants. So, we have been using this term, the brain model, and I will use it probably many times in this particular talk. The brain model is a sort of shorthand. It's a collective for the ideas that all aspects of consciousness can be explained completely by reference to the neurological functions of the brain, i.e. that somehow or other we've got this brain and the brain produces the consciousness that is who we are. Now, I feel that in my criticism of this model, I need to be a little fair, and I need to present all the evidence that directly substantiates this idea that the brain produces consciousness. So I've scoured all the material, I've looked at it all, tried to see where is the direct evidence and that directly supports this area, this idea. So I'd like to present it to you now. Yep, that's it. There's nothing. There is no direct empirical evidence that substantiates the claim that the brain can produce consciousness. I presented this slide in many scenarios, and I have yet to have someone challenge me on it. We're going to see that lots of people have theories and ideas, but no one has any direct evidence. There's nothing. Zero, zilch, kushne, nada, nothing. However, there's indirect justification. These are the 5 that I have turned up in the different kind of papers that have been written on this subject. There's lots of kind of variations, but they fall into these 5 categories. I'm not going to go into them in detail now for a reason that I'll explain. But let's just read them. These are the justification for the brain model. One, that the sectors of the brain with the most connected networks seem to be those which are associated with conscious experience. Fair enough. Second, that there is evidence of subconscious processing. Yeah, but I'm not quite sure what that really is meant to prove or establish. And in fact, when we come to look at this, we'll probably see that that's a negative rather than a plus for the brain model. The third, and this is probably the most regular and important one, brain damage changes mental state. If our brain is damaged or if it's affected by chemicals or anesthesia or whatever, there is a change in our mental state. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's a change in ourselves as the subject of that mental state. Certainly what we become aware of changes, but not necessarily that we as the conscious entity undergo an actual change to ourselves. Where the only thing that changes is what we are experiencing. So we'll be looking at that one in much more detail as we move along. The fourth one is thoughts and actions are related. And you probably think, yeah, that's kind of obvious, and it is. Again, not sure how that really provides a definite justification. And in fact, several of these, what we're going to see is that there are other explanations that might suit these observations better. The fifth one is that it seems to follow the evolution of species. That the idea is that we had smaller creatures with small brains, and now we've got bigger creatures like humans with bigger brains and more intelligence. Therefore, intelligence and awareness seems to follow the idea of a bigger brain. Therefore, maybe it's the brain that produces consciousness. Now, there's a completely different way of looking at that, which we will come to. So none of these are evidence on their own. None of them, and they're conjectures, and it's circumstantial at best. So we don't count them as direct evidence, and they're certainly not empirical. They're certainly not anything that you could build a scientific theory from. And remember what we're really trying to deal with in consciousness, and we've brought up this phrase from John Searle a few times. The essential trait of consciousness that we need to explain is unified, qualitative subjectivity, i.e. unified, that we are a unified entity, we are the same entity throughout our life. We are the subject of our experiences, and what we experience are the qualities of our inner world, the qualia of our experiences. So the point is that this is the test that a theory has to go through. It has to deal with this. And if a theory cannot cope with unified qualitative subjectivity, we're going to suggest it goes back to the drawing board. So we're being tough. And the reason I'm going to be tough is because I will also use this toughness to analyze our own postulation of the Atma paradigm when we come to it. So I think I'm being fair. So the question is, well, okay, we may not have evidence, but do we have any theories? Now, the problem isn't that we don't have a theory about how consciousness arises from the brain. The problem is there's too many of them. And this is a bit like the detective, you know, who's investigating the murder, and the mayor of the city wants to know, well, have you solved the murder yet? Have you any theories about who the murderer is? And the detective goes, oh yeah, we've got lots and lots and lots of theories about who the murderers might be. And that's not really satisfactory. So it is with consciousness. There are so many theories, and some of them overlap, some of them support each other, many of them are contradictory. And really, the way I'm going to be analyzing them is using the statements of the other physicalists who are approaching these theories and saying these don't really work. So amongst themselves, the physicalists know that they have not yet got a theory that actually deals with consciousness as it needs to be approached. And because of that, what you find in each of these theories is that they employ a type of strategy or approach that is their way of changing what we mean by consciousness, or changing what they mean by by proving consciousness comes from the brain. And so there's these 4 physicalist approaches. And before I go through the theories in detail, I'm going to take you through those 4 approaches so that you learn how to recognize a theory and see, does this really explain consciousness, or is it using one of these approaches to get round the fact that it cannot explain consciousness? So the 4 approaches go like this. The first is diminish. The idea is that you claim that consciousness is just information, or it's mental content, or it's the way the brain processes stuff. So it tries to reduce consciousness down to things like memories, and just say, well, you know, memories are really important for who we are, therefore maybe memories is all that consciousness is. Or it's the thoughts, feelings, and emotions that we have. Or maybe consciousness can be equated to the processing that goes on in the brain. That a kind of functional idea. And they sometimes refer to this as metacognition. We'll discuss that term a little later. Or it's to do with psychological states and the sense of our self or persona. So in many ways what they're trying to do is to reduce what we mean by consciousness away from that which is the unified subject of qualitative experiences down to something which is simply maybe psychological, or some kind of the information process within the physical system of the brain. Now, of course, that's the reductionist approach, but that's fine as long as you are able to explain the nature of phenomenal consciousness from what you would try to reduce it to, rather than say, I can explain the easy bits, like things how this neural pattern produces this particular data, which seems to correlate with some feeling that you have. That's not explaining consciousness itself. So diminish, watch out for that one, it's a biggie. The next one is conjure, i.e. What I mean by that is you're just conjuring up consciousness. You've got some process that you've identified, and then you claim, well, consciousness is an emergent property, or they use this word, epiphenomenon of brain activity. So an epiphenomenon is something that arises and it is unexpected from the starting conditions. Now, this basically is magic. It's a use of a non-scientific term, epiphenomenon. What does it really mean? You can never prove that something is an epiphenomenon. You can't explore it in cause and effect terms. So it has no real explanation. There's no evidence. It's just a statement that is made saying we've got this and we think then consciousness appears from it. So non-scientific theory cannot be tested. Now, the idea of an emergent property, of course, is reasonable. And I use this as an example, and I'm now showing Exhibit A, which is one of these little Kinder surprise balls to you. And it's made of 6 pieces, which you see on the left. Now, on their own, they're just little pieces which can slide over the table, but they can't roll. Put them together, and we've now got a rolling effect of the ball that you see on the right. So you could say that the rolling property is an emergent property from the parts of the pieces on the left. However, we can explain how those pieces come together and produce this rolling effect of the ball. We know how that works. We can relate it to the properties of the pieces. We can see the property of the whole, the ball. We can then say, here's why it rolls. So even if you call it an emergent property, it's one that we can explain. We cannot do that with consciousness. That's the point. When they claim that something is an emergent property, they cannot show from the pieces how consciousness could be constructed and produced from it. So therefore it is a little deceptive to try and claim consciousness as an emergent property. And we see this in, this is a little cartoon that someone produced. Basically you apply a little magic and we have consciousness. Can we see that trick again, please? Says the class. I remember one radio program I was doing for BBC Wales, and we were in the studio in Cardiff, and on the line was a professor from Oxford University. And at one point, the professor just said, well, we know that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of the brain. And the poor presenter of the program looked bemused and couldn't, because he'd never heard the word epiphenomenon before. So we had to explain to him that epiphenomenon is a type of non-scientific term that you use in order to explain something that you can't explain. It's a sleight of hand. The fourth approach, deny. Claim that consciousness is false, is a false or virtual illusion. Basically, it doesn't effectively exist, or it doesn't exist in the way that we believe that it exists. So the claim is that consciousness is an illusion created by the brain, and also, in this particular scenario, they will say that it has no efficacy or agency, i.e. that consciousness isn't doing anything. You'll remember that came up last week when we discussed the idea of the hallucinating brain, or the brain that is that says we are experiencing the world with a half-second delay, but that's all right because we have no real interaction with the world. We're just watching it. The brain and the body are doing everything themselves without any recourse to our willpower. So it should be understood that there is, as we said last week, there is no evidence that substantiates this claim. Rather, it comes out of the opposite. It's because we cannot explain the issues of consciousness, qualia, the subjective self, by reference to the brain, that people then say, well, in that case, it must not exist, because we've only got these brain functions, and if they don't produce consciousness, then consciousness can't exist. Then the fourth, promise. Someday we'll have a theory of the physical source of consciousness. Well, I mean, anyone could claim they'll someday have anything. It doesn't make it so, and it's a question whether you want to bet on that promise. So the idea is that in the future we will find consciousness, and there's people have different things by which they mean that. Some people say, well, it's going to be in sort of neurophysiology. We'll make some new discovery about how the brain works, or what's in the brain, or something that some network or some activity that will explain where consciousness comes from. Or we'll have lots of little ideas which will maybe be able to put together to form an overall explanation. So those are two kind of neuroscience type of theories. Or, and this is a different approach, we'll create conscious machines, because that's what we've always believed we could do, and there's certainly popular presentations on TV and film that would seem to kind of corroborate this. There's so many programs that give the idea that perhaps machines or robots will become conscious, and usually you get to see them before they're conscious, but then there's some kind of fancy computer code or virus or something or other that is able to infect these machines, and then suddenly they become sentient. Or with the Amazon series on Upload, it's that you can download consciousness, because they think all that you are is the sum total of your thoughts and memories and how you process them. So if you download all the processing and storage of your brain, then technically you've downloaded consciousness. Nope, that's not how it works at all. And actually we need to understand that the brain actually hasn't got that sort of information, never mind the conscious bit in it. So, besides promising a future, all of these are based on a kind of diminished view of consciousness. Hence, we've got one of these diminished signs appearing on the screen here. And probably they arise because there was the idea of the Turing Test, which still is around. Alan Turing, of course, famous for his work during the war, and, you know, a pioneer in computing. So it's not clear whether it was his actual intention to use his test as a test of consciousness, but rather one of machine intelligence, and particularly how quickly, you know, computers might develop intelligence. So you probably all know how this works. We have the interrogator player C, and it's in one room, and in another room is a computer, which is called player A, and then another human, player B. And the player C, the interrogator, is asking questions to each of A and B. And the job of the computer is to try and convince the interrogator that it is the human being. So it needs to respond to the questions in such a way that the interrogator goes, yeah, that's fine, that's a human. Now, there was a big claim a couple of years back that the Turing test was passed, but that particular circumstance was that the computer was pretending to be a 13-year-old child speaking in a second language. I think it was Slovenian or something. You might say that's not a full test. But from my point of view, I think this is absolutely possible. I reckon that we're all being fooled 30% of the time, which is the Turing test threshold, by various chatbots that we get calling us up for surveys, or when we you know, call customer services. And on Twitter, there is reckoned to be thousands of chatbots, which are just AI things doing their little Twitter bit. One of the most famous was Microsoft's Twitter bot called Tay, and this was released a few years back, and it first didn't know anything about Twitter, but it had to learn as it kind of went along. So it first of all, it was just issuing gibberish, but then it got a few tweets back, saw how they were worded, and then managed to start learning the program and learning how to respond. But it had to be shut down within 24 hours because it had developed the most xenophobic, homophobic invective, and it was just abusive in all sorts of ways, because that's what it learned from the Twitter sphere. So it was replaced by Zoe, who is considered to be your new best friend according to Microsoft. But Zoe is so eager to avoid any confrontation that she will shut down any suggestion of a discussion on politics, religion, gender, or whatever. So these are out there. They're examples of the attempts to pass the Turing test. Now, the thing about artificial intelligence is that at the moment it may fool us quite a bit of the time, but it's considered to be a little inept because at best it is narrow. So it's artificial narrow intelligence. All the programs, all the robots, all the computers that are designed have very specific jobs that they can do, but they're not good at what is general intelligence. And at the moment, that's the real kind of target of the development of AI. Cracking general intelligence, meaning that you can get an AI program or a robot to be able to do the many different tasks that a human can do practically at the same time. And there's some interesting tests for this one. One of them is the coffee one, where the idea is that you should be able to send a robot into a strange house it's never been in, and it should be able to find all the ingredients and make a cup of coffee. Another one is that it can assemble some kind of IKEA piece of furniture from all the instructions. And of course, we'd all be delighted when that gets cracked and there's someone to help us on that. But then there's the artificial superintelligence, when AI exceeds human intelligence. Now, the thing is that these we're developing these using kind of artificial neural networks. And at the moment, although there are very clever deep learning programs which the AI algorithms can run themselves. They need to be supervised at the beginning and at the end, as this diagram shows, in a simple kind of aspect of image recognition. Image recognition actually is not that simple. It's actually quite a difficult thing to do, where you've got pictures of different animals, and somehow or other the features of that have to be broken down into bits of data that the computer can analyze and start to bring together and then make a judgment for. But the only way for the computer to make a judgment is to be able to be told that it's comparing it to a picture that has been supervised, i.e. tagged by a human. So the fact that this is an elephant at the bottom, then it's able to say, well, that seems to match that picture rather than any other. This is an elephant. So this is supervised task learning. So with neural networks, they're not conscious. They have no awareness of the images of data. There's no reason to suppose that they have. People might say, well, how do we know? I suppose in one sense we can't know, but we have no reason to suppose that they are. They require preset motivations, i.e. the algorithm defined the program's motivation or task. And of course there's rules set for the program and what, for instance, if they are certain bots trying to kind of learn some particular thing. So the rule sets, well, what should they favor and what should they not favor? What benefits them, what doesn't? So they're able to play little kind of evolutionary games and kind of show activities, and there's some, or learn how to play a game of football or something. And they need feedback from humans, either direct or via a library of tagged photos or crowdsource input. So everything we're doing on the internet, of course, is being used to help program AI. The Human Brain Project is an interesting one. They've been given about 100 million euros, I think it is, and they're trying to map every neural connection of the brain. Now, by doing that, they hope to build a functioning software simulation of the entire human brain on a supercomputer, neuron by neuron. A lot of people say, yep, you can do that. It may be helpful for neurology, but it still doesn't tell us anything about consciousness. One of them, who's a critic of this, is Kevin O'Regan, who runs an institute in Paris. He's got his own strong views about the physicalist idea, which he kind of is firmly entrenched in. But he says, no, this doesn't help. You cannot create consciousness by software, because software is a language, and so it requires extra information to be interpreted. Binary numbers don't feel like anything. They do not understand and experience redness as red. That's where the whole thing kind of falls down as far as he's concerned. So we have in the world of AI and two kind of different viewpoints. We have those who say, who are the weak AGI, say that, okay, machines will match and surpass human intelligence and can act as if conscious, i.e. they can mimic and simulate us. Whereas the strong AGI is the idea that machines can match and surpass human intelligence and are sentient and conscious. Now, some years ago, I think the majority of those working in neuroscience and philosophy of mind might well have plumped for strong AGI, and there are still some who do. But it's becoming much more of a debate, and there is a stronger and stronger kind of element within the philosophers, and they're affecting the engineers to say, no, really what you're going to achieve is a weak AGI. Work on matching human intelligence. That's a goal in itself. Don't worry whether they will be conscious or not. It's not likely to happen. And I think this is best summed up by Anil Seth, who's a physicalist working at the Sackler Institute in the University of Sussex. And his comment is, simulating the activities of consciousness within a computer. It's like simulating weather patterns. You can mimic what's happening in the world of weather, but you haven't got clouds and winds inside the computer. But perhaps we are confusing ourselves by putting human faces on machines. This is Sophia, launched in 2016, now updated. And the idea that, that you put a human face on a machine is a bit like Thomas the Tank Engine. The idea that you're anthropomorphizing a machine, which actually is simply a functional thing, whether it's chugging along railway tracks or whether it's crunching data, it's still a thing. So a little poll here for you to take part in. Do you think that one day machines or AI or robots can become conscious? I'd like to hear your views on that. Now, quick recap while you're doing that. The 4 physicalist approaches. Diminish, consciousness is just information, mental content or processing. Or conjure, consciousness is an emergent property. Or deny, claim that consciousness is a false or virtual illusion. Or promise, someday we'll have a theory. Okay? Now I'm going to look at some of the types of consciousness theories. And I'm going to go through these probably very, very quickly, because I can't do justice to them in full. I can't go through all the whys and wherefores of them. So really all I can do is help you analyze what to look for if you want to look into these individual ones with more detail. First of all, these are all the physicalist reductionist versions. They fall into different categories. First, cognitive and neural ones. The 3 biggie ones that we've had in recent times are the neural correlates of consciousness, global workspace theory, and integrated information theory, which actually comes up again, the integrated information theory. And they kind of look like this. The top line shows what kind of subconscious brain activity. And what we see is isolated flashes within the brain. However, when a person reports that they are conscious of particular something, then we see more and bigger coalitions. That's the neural correlative consciousness model. The global workspaces starts the same. It shows the individual flashes, but when there's consciousness, what they say is that something is then broadcast across the whole of the brain. And the third one, IIT, says, well, from the local ones, that's set up a little network, but when the network becomes more complex, that's when consciousness appears. So they're just different ideas that claim at a certain point consciousness appears. They're doing 2 things. They're diminishing what we mean by consciousness usually, or they're conjuring that simply to say, well, we've got some correlation, that means we're producing consciousness. I'm afraid that doesn't follow. And so these aren't, although they are established in the textbooks, they're not considered to be satisfactory or complete in terms of explaining consciousness. And besides the big 3, there's a whole list of others that can be added to this type of approach. Then there's kind of the more psychological ones, higher order and reflexive. First of all, this is the idea of higher order thought and higher order perception. You may remember in our second lecture, we gave you the meditation of thinking some thoughts, then thinking about the thoughts that you are having, and then thinking about yourself as the subject of those thoughts. Now, this is the same idea. This is a picture of John Searle's Chinese room. Someone's putting a message in one side with a symbol on it. A person who doesn't understand the symbols looks up the book and says, oh, that symbol should be replaced with this other symbol, and then he puts it down the outshoot to the next person. So information is being processed with no awareness of what it means on the inside. So that was just a little thought experiment John Searle came up with. But the idea of higher order is that, okay, that may be going on, but then maybe there's a process that is analyzing the analysis. And maybe there's a higher state that's analyzing the analysis of the analysis. And at some point, maybe that's what consciousness is. So that's the kind of higher order idea. And then there's ideas which kind of relate to that, which are called reflexive. So they kind of focus on what it is like to be conscious, but they're not able to untangle themselves as the conscious entity from that which is being explored within their mind. So their idea is that you become conscious when you become aware of your thoughts. Now, that's also true with attention schema, that when you are conscious of a particular thing, you are now thinking of it. You may also be thinking of yourself thinking of it. And they say, oh, that's when consciousness happens. But these are just states of consciousness. These are the things that we are aware of. We can either just be aware of the thoughts, we can be aware of thinking about the thoughts, or we can be aware of ourselves as the thinker. We've already analysed all that. It really does not explain that consciousness arises from those things. Rather, it actually indicates that consciousness must be separate from all those processing activities. So thinking equated to processing is diminish, and that the idea that higher order processing leads to the sense of being aware. If the lower order processing isn't conscious, then why should the higher order itself be conscious? So no explanation for the subject, that person who has the thoughts and who recognizes, I am the thinker and the observer of all this mental content. And of course, no explanation for qualia. So falls down. Other types are type identity. When they talk about identity, they mean identity as an identical. The idea that conscious mental states are absolutely identical to the physical neural state that gave rise to them. And I suppose that's very much a kind of standard brain model idea. And it's kind of been rephrased in recent times using an interesting word, that conscious reality supervenes on the physical. That means that somehow the conscious experience that you have, including qualia, is composed of the physical, or is realized, it is brought to reality by the physical. So this is, in one sense, it's considered an limitativist idea, because it's kind of happy to get rid of the idea of consciousness as the sort of thing that we believe in, but it's also conjuring. So either what is emerges, what is supervened, if it's real, then you're conjuring. If it's not real, then they're denying. So representational ones are similar. Basically, they say that the representational features of qualia, i.e. the redness of red, which arises from a particular set of neural data, they are basically one and the same thing. Somehow they try to explain qualia by denying it. And yes, actually we would suggest that what we experience has some relation with what the brain's got. We saw last week that it's impossible to completely explain our experience from what the brain's got, but there is some relationship. But it's like this. On the left-hand side, that's what the brain's got as data. It's got the picture with the colors represented as data, 1, 2's, two different colors. But what we experience is not the data of that, but the actual color of it. And that's what needs to be explained. There's no use just saying, well, this obviously comes out of this. That's not an explanation. We need to know how. And functionalist is very much the same. This is a functional approach. Probably the most famous of the denying approaches is Daniel Dennett's multiple drafts model. And basically he says the only thing that exists is the flow of ideas in the head, in your minds. It's a narrative of all the thoughts going on in your mind. So he's saying that there isn't really a self to experience that, it's just a narrative, and because that narrative is coherent, you believe that you are experiencing a coherent picture and understanding of the world. You are believing the story that's being presented. But that you are not really there. Really all there is the story. Now, probably this is best addressed by Galen Strawson, a philosopher, and he presents it like this. What's the silliest claim ever made? The competition is fierce, but I think the answer is easy. Some people have denied the existence of consciousness, meaning they've denied conscious experience, the subjective character of experience, what it is like of experience. And he goes on to say that that denial makes any type of religious belief look as definite as believing the grass is green. This is such a silly claim. So, final kind of grouping, quantum-based theories. The idea is that quantum physics is a bit of a mystery, and consciousness is a bit of a mystery. So, there's a law of minimization of mystery. So maybe quantum mysteries and consciousness mysteries go together, and maybe one explains the other, in which case we've got one mystery. So that's advancement. But at the moment there isn't actually a theory that really does that. Because we say we are a coherent, unified individual subject, I believe I am the one entity experiencing my life. So that's a certain coherence. So sometimes they kind of equate that to the coherence that is found in a particular state of matter called a Bose-Einstein state. The idea that when you've got a group of atoms, the atoms behave actually as one. You cannot distinguish one atom from another. Somehow or other, this property of coherence emerges in this state. Or entanglement, quantum entanglement is another type of sort of coherence. So it's not really very well worked out. Other uses of quantum physics for consciousness actually involve these sort of things: chaotic, nonlinear dynamics, non-algorithmic programming, and particularly a theory by Penrose and Hameroff, orchestrated objective reduction. Now, what these try to do is that they try to bring in kind of quantum non-determinism. And the reason for doing that is because if you just look at the standard kind of deterministic processes of the brain, where is free will? You cannot account for that. So, but if the neurons are firing by some kind of quantum process, which they might say is random, we will question that down the line, then you've got at least something which is non-deterministic, determining what we think and then do. Now, does that really protect and bring back free will? That's not really very clear. However, I'm very interested in the ORC-OR and have had personal discussions with Stuart Hameroff on that subject. We will be returning to some of the actual scientific evidence that he has uncovered and showing how that is actually very interesting and supportive of the Atma paradigm. But one last thing from the quantum-based things is that because of all this, many of the physicists then suggest that maybe consciousness is a fundamental property of physical reality. Now, we've now just left the reductionist camp. They now say that consciousness can't be reduced and that we may need to regard it as a fundamental property. And of course, they would like to kind of, they could say of reality, but they like to insist that it is physical reality. Now, when you claim that reality has to be, remember, a physical reality, the question is, well, what other reality were you thinking of? In which case they have to postulate some other reality other than physical. So perhaps there's a tautology there. Anyway, the point for our purposes is that it's becoming clear that it is not really viable to construct a theory of consciousness based on reducing it to the activities of the brain. Now, what I want to do is just take you through a little progression of these theories. And that is that few decades ago and up into recent times, the idea was that brain structure and functions explains consciousness, at least the easy problem. So they had a process of diminish, and they didn't even worry about that. You know, they were just happy to explain the easy problems. Really, that changed when David Chalmers gave his address in 1994, and the issue of qualia and subjectivity became central in the philosophers' minds. So then the next theory that really kind of took over was that consciousness is an emergent epiphenomenon. So they were conjuring. That's still popular, it's still being quoted. But it's not amongst the philosophers and those who are really involved in the theory of consciousness, it's not that popular anymore. Why? Because if you're saying that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, i.e. it is something that is so different from physical stuff that we can't explain how it got there, you're kind of straying into the dualist world. Oh, and they don't like that. They don't want to kind of bring in any kind of dualism which might indicate that we have strayed from utter pure physicalism. So that kind of was dropped. And the next one, it became very popular until recently actually, was that the idea of consciousness is illusion. That was being promoted. And again, obviously still some of these people are still kind of doing this, but we can't find consciousness, the self, qualia in the brain, therefore they must not exist, or at least they don't exist as we might think. It's some kind of illusion, some kind of echo. We don't have to try and explain it. So that's kind of moved on. And Galen Strawson, you know, and others are very strong critics of that type of idea. So then this is where it's at the moment. A promise that we need to understand matter better. And this is an acknowledgement that there is no theory for consciousness at this time. And if we're going to get it, it's going to be in the future. And these are the new breed of physicalists. They accept that consciousness, qualia, the self, and free will are real. And that's a big, big factor. Because they accept that that's what you have to explain when you're dealing with consciousness. But their approach is that, well, we don't understand the physics of matter well enough to say for certain that we will never have an explanation for phenomenal consciousness at some time in the future. So it's a promise. And it's a, you know, there's a wide range of people. At the top, you've got Galen Strawson, and then Christoph Koch, and then a little further down, Giulio Tononi, and then on the bottom right is Richard Dawkins. Surprise, surprise. We know his views on religion and his claims for physicalism, but he is now in this camp. He is not denying consciousness. He knows that's a dead duck. You cannot deny that consciousness is real. But he's just saying, well, we don't understand matter well enough. We will in the future. But really what this is getting at is that consciousness is a fundamental property of physical reality. And this is bringing in something which, if probably a decade ago, would have been laughed out of the laboratory and the lecture theatre. Panpsychism. The idea that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous in the natural world. That idea is that just like you've got physical properties of charge, mass and spin within all matter, so there's also consciousness as another property which we haven't accounted for. You know, something that cannot be, it's fundamental, can't be reduced to anything else. It's ubiquitous because it's everywhere. It's coexisting with all the other properties. So sometimes this is phrased as the belief that everything material, however small, has an element of individual consciousness. Now, this is not the Vedic idea at all. But what is interesting is when you look at what the physicalists have been claiming for all these years, it's interesting that this is now one of the ideas that they're taking seriously because all their other ideas have failed. And particularly there's a version of panpsychism, which is, we mentioned before, integrated information theory. And basically what it's saying is that all matter contains information, and biological and physical systems integrate information, and consciousness arises when the integrated information of a system is greater than the sum of the information in its parts. So it's equating consciousness and information. And in fact, one of the famous statements by Max Tegmark, who was the original guy behind this, he says, consciousness is what information feels like. And that's a bit of a conjuring thing, that somehow you can just say that when information is processed, when it's integrated, that's what consciousness feels like. Now, there's no doubt that what we experience in our conscious perception integrates information within the brain into the experiences that we have. But that doesn't mean that the information itself is becoming conscious. That's the real kind of failing in all of this. And anyway, they measure the level of integration as a unit of phi. Unfortunately, this theory, and maybe I'm being over harsh here, but it diminishes what we mean by consciousness. It conjures consciousness out of integration of information. It kind of denies qualia. In fact, they do deny qualia. They say we can't explain qualia. We're not trying to. It's just, it's not important. And it's a promise, because even in the mathematics that's behind this, in the calculation of the quantity of phi or integrated information, you cannot do that for the human brain. You cannot even do it for the 300 neurons of a nematode worm. So there's a certain promise in the head. But you can do it for some of the physical systems. And here they are, that you may now be a little worried to know that your phone, your smart fridge, and your CDs actually are very, very conscious according to this calculation. And they know this is one of the problems of it. Particularly anything that uses a kind of Vandermonde matrix, which is used in decoding circuits and CDs and things. Basically, they reckon that scale up the circuitry in a CD to human brain levels, and a CD would be far more conscious than we are. So you may be kind of wondering what your CD rack on the wall is chatting to you about. But this is considered to be a little bit of a failing of the philosophy. And it's just another little ad absurdum aspect of a theory. But we appreciate actually that there is an attempt to go beyond the previous boundaries and to look at consciousness as something that could be fundamental to reality. And this brings in many other philosophers are now saying we need a theory that brings together elements from all the other theories. Now, if they mean all the other physicalist theories, they're not really going to be able to improve on, because either individual or compiled, they're still all dealing with the same problem, and they're just, multiplying their problem. They're not dealing with unified qualitative subjectivity. So, however, I actually appreciate many of the analysis that are given in the others, but what we will see is that the Atma Paradigm model, based on how the Vedas explain the nature of consciousness and its interaction with physical stuff, particularly the mind and brain, will show how that actually incorporates all the best bits of evidence and all the best observations that other theories have looked at. But it explains it in a comprehensive way that actually satisfies what we're trying to achieve in explaining consciousness. Now, I've gone over time. I apologize. There was an awful lot in this, and probably I've gone too quickly. I'm willing to stay on for Q&A. So if you could anyone who's got a question, please type it in on the Facebook, and hopefully that'll get fed through to me. But while you're doing that, just to give a little summary. As we said, there's no direct evidence to establish that the brain can produce consciousness. There's only some circumstantial ideas, which we're going to look at again. There's no current plausible theory. So ultimately, there is no real justification for asserting that the brain produces consciousness. Many people may want to believe that that's the case, that's the truth. They may believe that in the future we will have an explanation, and of course everyone is welcome to their own beliefs. But please do not say that that is the scientific position, or even that that is necessarily a logical, philosophical position. Please accept that if you want to believe that there will be a theory that the brain produces consciousness, you are in the realm of belief. And it's a belief that you will find hard to substantiate. It's really blind faith. So efforts to reduce consciousness to known physical properties have failed. And hence, there is an openness to an idea that consciousness is irreducible. It must be its own distinct fundamental property. That is the door being opened to us now to introduce the Atma. And that will be the subject of our next talk. So, I don't know if there's any questions coming through, or if we have time even to take them. But so far, no questions. In which case, I apologize that going over time, but I hope that you appreciate that you've got ways now of thinking about theories that you might hear from others. And perhaps this will equip you for your own analysis and study of the subject. But again, I thank you very much. And we will see you next week when we are introducing the Atma, an alternative model to explain the phenomenon of consciousness. Thank you very much. All the best to you all.